Welcome to TESO Consulting Group's DEI podcast series, Why Is It So Hard? Shining Through the Shadow of Resistance. I'm Dr. Tonya Breland.
And I am Erika.
Welcome back. I'm Dr. Tonya Breland.
And I'm Erika. And this is our podcast series, Why Is It So Hard? Shining Through the Shadows of Resistance. And as some of you know, in this podcast series, we discuss issues that prevent us from being socially just and free. And the goal is to disrupt the status quo of racial inequality and inequity in systems, really, that we all kind of operate in. And so each episode challenges us to be the change that we want to be. And so in this is the second part of our series, which is
Things I Wish I Knew About Race.
And so today we're talking about just something that we've all either talked about or thought about, which is, what about the N-word?
Ooh. You may be touching on some nerves today. What about the N-word?
About the N-word.
Ooh, you won't be hearing us say it, that's for sure.
No, you won't. You won't. But we do get that it is something, particularly as educators, and particularly in spaces, well, even it doesn't really have to be a diverse space. Right. I mean, the truth is that that word gets bandied about fairly frequently in a lot of the spaces that we operate. And so it's important really to just kind of pause and just really unpack it and talk about what might be just a really effective approach, I think.
Yeah, so do you remember there was an episode, I guess it was on Peacock, where, and I'm not trying to give shout out to Peacock per se, but it was the show was Bel Air, kind of a remake, if you will, of Fresh Prince of Bel Air.
Yes.
And in the episode, Carlton, one of the characters on the show, who was kind of like the preppy character, and he was a part of the lacrosse team. And so the lacrosse team and Carlton were listening to a song, and the song had the N-word. And the lacrosse team was predominantly made up of his white classmates, and he being a character who was a black character. And so they're singing this song, and the Will Smith character, who is the cousin to Carlton and lives with Carlton, is like, "What are you doing?" You know, he's like upset because, you know, all of the kids are repeating the N-word in this particular song, and it's like a big thing. And he's like, you know, and Carlton doesn't want to like make any waves, and he's basically like, you know, pushing, you know, his cousin back, like, you know, leave us alone, whatever. It's not a problem, leave it alone. And of course, the Will character is like really upset about it, and you know, what have you. And what we find with this N-word is that oftentimes there's controversy about the word.
Yes.
You know?
Yeah. And it puts people in spaces, particularly where, like in that example, where we have, individuals who are white, individuals who are black. It puts people in spaces, one of confusion, but sometimes there's like this really great conflict. So some you are like, you absolutely can't use that word. And some are like, well, it's a song. Why not? It's a song. I really like this song and I don't mean anything by it. And that really is precisely some of the challenges, really. It's like this real conflict around and this real ambivalence around the use of that word.
Because we've read a scenario or a case study, if you will, about a classroom situation where the teacher overhears a group of kids using the N-word, but putting the A at the end of it instead of the ER. And the teacher's like, what did you say? You know, and tries to, you know, find out what they're saying. And, you know, the kids basically brush it off as, you know, it's not that big of a deal. And, you know, the non-black student is basically like, you know, they don't mind that, you know,
if I use it.
And the teacher tries to address, you know, the one black student in the group who the other kid talks over and responds for him. And, the teacher essentially is trying to get to the bottom of how the student feels about this word being used. And ultimately, the case study kind of leaves the reader having to kind of sift through, the complexities of that scenario and, how it should be addressed, why it should be addressed, and in what ways should it be addressed.
Yeah. Again, another complex scenario, right? Because in that same case study, there is a Black student, a girl, who says, you shouldn't use that word.
Right.
And you're lucky you're not getting hurt, or something like that. And the teacher responds kind of harshly to her. And so, so in this space where you do have an African American student who says, I'm offended by that, I don't like that, so then what happens, particularly if a non-Black student feels licensed to use it? And so I think that scenario is really good. And even the one from the television show, because particularly as educators, we face that scenario all the time. I know I did as a teacher, but we face that all the time. So we hear it, we don't like it. And so then what?
Right.
And very often, because we hear it so much, we don't really do anything about it. We let it go. Or we'll say, okay, we'll do something passive, like watch your language. My kids are still using it. And so then what happens? Like, so what do you do? I think one of the things to really understand is really important to understand the history of that word and the weight that it carries.
Yeah, so let's talk a little bit about that history, because I think a lot of teachers are very uncomfortable when they hear the word, especially non-Black teachers, but even Black teachers might be uncomfortable when they hear the term because they're not really sure how it should be addressed. And a lot of times school districts will just have a blatant, no tolerance policy, but I think we should understand some of the nuances and even kind of share a little bit more about that. So when we think about the N word actually is derived from a Latin word, Niger. And that word actually just means the color Black. And you'll see in a lot of different languages, where the color Black is a word that's similar. So in Italian it's nero, and in other languages it's very similar. So it's just the color Black. So like your blouse is Black. There's nothing that's problematic about that, about the word Black. The N word became derogatory in the 1800s. So it's first written about by a guy named Jose Easton. He's a Black intellectual who was writing during those times. He was a minister from Connecticut. And he wrote, and it was really interesting because, in those days, it's really interesting to read the way that they wrote. And I actually have to read this because I just think it's so eloquently written. So, Jose Easton wrote that the term is, quote, is an opprobrious term employed to impose contempt upon Blacks as an inferior race. The term in itself would be perfectly harmless were it used only to distinguish one class of society from another, but it is not used with that intent. It flows from the fountain of purpose to injure. Wow. When you hear that, when you read that, like, what are your thoughts? And we can get back more into some of the history, but just,
So I think it actually speaks to when people say it's just a word, right? And I think what Reverend Easton's point is, like, it's not just a word, it's the intent, right, of the word. And that last part about, it flows from the fountain of purpose to injure. Right. So the whole purpose of that word was injury.
Right.
That's what kind of stuck out for me with that.
No, that, I mean, I think that's really powerful to mention. And it's critical that teachers understand this history as well. So
Yeah.
now this, this gentleman, Jose Easton, I've read about him in more than one source. So in our previous episode, we talk about using multiple sources. In more than one source, they quote his work, and they talk about, his understanding, because he really is one of the first ones to write about the use of the N-word. And what's also important to note is how it was used and how society used the word really to create injury and to create shame for white children. So for example, they would say things like, in rearing their children, white parents, and this is back in like the 1800s and potentially even beyond that. They would say if a child did something bad and they were reprimanded, they may say that you're being worse than an N-word, or you're as ignorant as the N-word, or you have no more credit than somebody, that's the N-word. Children were threatened that if they misbehaved, they could be carried off by an old N-word person, or they'd be made to sit with one, or any way that they can create shame with a child. Like, you don't want to be associated with an N-word person. And so it was really a negative. Negative is, it almost seems like a kind word. It was just demeaning. Even the childhood rhyme, eeny, meeny, miny, mo. How many of us grew up doing the childhood rhyme? Like, we're going to play tag. Now everybody put your foot in, in the circle, and you go around and you that whole thing was not what we knew it was to be as children. The original framing of that, or phraseology, if you will, was eeny, meeny, miny, mo, catch a blank by the toe, catch an N-word by the toe. And so that dates back to the 1800s. And here, as children, when we were children, we were saying it, but we didn't know where it came from. No one had taught us that. And so, this N-word has deep roots.
Deep roots. So it didn't just start with music, right? It didn't just start with hip hop, but it has these really deep roots. So, when we think about like, why should we address it, it's really understanding the historical context, that because it was really meant to demean, but also dehumanize.
That's correct.
Right. And so if I don't think of you as a human, if I think of you as an N-word, which is separate from everybody else, then you are dehumanized. And then that justifies my treatment of you, justifies my marginalization of a group of people. So it is important to address the use of the word, regardless of how it's pronounced. And even regardless of how kids say, oh, I don't know, that's my friend. This is just a term of endearment. Like, it must be addressed, right? And so we set those expectations high. I will say that in my classroom, and kids would say that, oh, it's just a, it's just a slang term. It doesn't mean anything. It means a lot, and is not allowed in this space. At all. And I mean, even in, there would be a conversation in the corner of the room, and if I overheard it, everything stops. Like, it was that important. And what happens is, if you do that enough, kids will rise to the level of your expectations. But when we let it go, when we don't address it, when we use passive terms like, okay, that's enough, or those kinds of phrases where kids know that you're not going to do anything, it continues to be used. But you can create the space where we don't use that language here. And that's it. And helping them to understand the reason why. So I think as children, we may not have understood, the reason why it was such a horrific word. I was born at the tail end of the 60s. And, I know that it was commonly used,
in, along with other terms like men being called boy or women being called girl. I'm talking about black men and
Yeah.
black women, to demean and to create a superiority versus inferiority stratification in society. That N word was also used in that manner. And what's really interesting, when I was doing a little reading on the N word in particular, they were talking about the number of court cases that were driven by, some type of racial harm, if you will. And so we know that other racial groups have, derogatory terms associated with those racial groups as well. But in the court system, and I'm talking about the Supreme Court system, many of those other terms would come up, several dozens of times. For example, some maybe even come up a couple hundred times, some of the other derogatory terms. But the derogatory term that came up thousands of times in the court documents was the N word.
Wow.
So they're, going back all the way to President Richard Nixon and his use of the word, even Lyndon Baines Johnson and his use of the word, never positively, no positive derivation of it at all, always meaning to demean. And so, the history is so steep and so deep, that even you could see it all over the history books. But unfortunately, it's not being taught in schools anywhere. And I agree with you that there is no place for it in the school system. There really isn't any place for it at all, even in music. And I think the mistake that a lot of our young artists may make is they think they're taking back the term. Like I've heard that before. I'm taking back this term. I'm going to make it my own. And what they're doing is they're not really doing that at all. They're creating confusion in society and giving people permission to use it without the context. The context is this history that we're trying to share, and it's important that is taught to all of the students so they can make a more educated decision. So do I want to use this term now that I know and understand, what this means?
Yeah, I think as a part of that confusion, particularly somebody who is not African American, is the African American use of the term, right? And so it confuses people. So why can they use it and I can't use it? If they're not offended, if you have people that are, and I often think about like my father and his brothers, and anytime I heard that word, it was almost like. When they would use that word, it would be for people who were doing stuff that was like undesirable, right? So it wasn't like there was love in that word. It was more like those people who are not respecting themselves or not respecting their communities and that kind of thing. And I think in that space, it started to become confusing because it's like, well, they're using it, why can't anybody else? But I think, like you said before, there's no space for it. Right? There's no space for it, especially when you understand the history and especially when you teach kids the history.
Right.
And I think that's so important that they really get that because it particularly, when we talk about education being relevant, that's relevant. That's relevant. If they hear it, if they're using it, that's relevant. And we want them to not use it. We want them to get that this is not acceptable, right? And there's no space for it.
Right.
But as long as, that debate gets carried out on social media or whatever, then it continues to, to be perpetuated, to be used. So I think it's really, going back to, one, getting, educating yourself about the social and historical context, but also doing that for students. And then saying, because of this, we won't use it. As an English teacher, I taught Huck Finn. And one of the reasons why I taught Huck Finn, because it allowed me to really dive deep into the use of that word. And it was the only way that I could do it, right? But it's like, I'm not going to be able to to really sort of like educate kids on this word if I don't teach this text. There was no magic in the text Huckleberry Finn, but I knew through the curriculum that I was teaching that this was the only place where I could really sort of safely have these conversations with kids. And they were powerful conversations. They were things that kids just didn't know because they hadn't been taught.
Right.
You know, and so once we did that, there were kids that were like, I did not know this. I only knew this about the word, or I only heard it in a song or whatever. And it's like, there were kids who were like, Black, white, Hispanic, Asian kids, I will never use that word again. And it's like, that's what I wanted. That was the outcome that we wanted, But that has to also be, that couldn't come. First of all, it didn't happen just because I'm a Black teacher. Those really safe conversations and those really effective conversations came because I educated myself on the word. And I really, really thought about like how safe. One, we didn't do it on day one of the class, right?
Sure.
We did it when it was, when I knew that it was a safe space, a safe learning space for us to have these conversations. I had built relationships with the kids, so they were safe with me and I was safe with them. Right. And they were safe with each other. And then we can have really tough conversations like that, but not until we built that safe community of learning.
Right.
Yeah.
But if for some reason, before that community is built and, because we often get questions by educators, they'll have these scenarios where they overhear the kids throwing the word out, either reciting a song or just calling each other that, using it as a term of endearment. And the teachers, many of whom are white teachers, ask us, what are we supposed to do with that? Like, how am I supposed to address that? We also have seen where the word has been used in a demeaning way.
Yeah.
So the school system then has to respond to it. And a lot of times they're not sure, how do we respond to this when we have a racial incident where the N word is used? We've heard, a number of times where, it would be something that would blow up in the whole community. It's all over social media now. It's in the newspapers. And so now the school is doing everything in their power to try to bring everybody back into good graces. And it goes beyond just like, I'm going to teach this instruction, because they often aren't ready when this happens and they're reacting to it and trying to respond to it. And so how would you advise a school system, a school district, in addressing an issue like this, or being even in ways that they can be proactive to hopefully help avoid incidences where students are intentionally trying to demean their classmates or their peers? How would you recommend that a school district address that or be proactive?
Yeah. I think, so language matters, right?
Sure.
Words matter. So one of the things I think I would really start with is having kids come up with like, what are alternatives to this word? So particularly if we're saying that we're using this word in a space where it's safe or whatever, this is my friend or whatever. Is there another word you could use? In place of the N word? Could you use a word like brother? Could you use a word like dude? Could you use a word like friend? Like, could you use so have kids come up with, acceptable language. I think that would be proactive. And I would do that in the beginning of the year, particularly if you know that that you have heard this word and it could be a problem. I think the other thing that I would do is, going back to what we talked about, like I would have lessons on the social and historical context of the word, so that there are no excuses about, oh, I didn't know, I've heard it in this place, I've heard it in this place. Some kids hear it in their families, and so it's like in this space, and I think make sure that your teachers understand it too, and understand that, and I think you have to start there. But also empower teachers in terms of like, how do we address it? So, and if I address it, if Dr. Breland in her classroom addresses it this way, then Miss Leek needs to address it too. Like, we need to be on the same page. So I can't say it in Miss Leek's classroom if I can't say it in Dr. Breland's classroom. And I think that that's really important in terms of making sure we have that consistency, that it is not allowed here. It is not acceptable here,
Right.
you know. And I think that's a good place to start. But I think that education, making sure that we all understand the, you know, why this word is so injurious.
I really love the idea of having the students come up with replacement words because they take ownership of that.
Yes,
And
yes.
anytime students take ownership, they're more likely to follow it because it's
Absolutely.
theirs and it's not the adults imposing something on them, but it's them coming up with their own solution.
Absolutely.
You know, it's their buy-in at
Yes,
that point.
yes,
You know,
yes.
And I feel like that's powerful.
Yes,
You know,
absolutely,
right? That's a
absolutely.
really
And they will use that language. They will use that language. I think also bringing kids on. So when somebody does make a mistake, because this is that restorative practice piece too. When somebody does make a mistake and use that term, what do we as a community do? We as a community, meaning the students too. What do we as a community do? And I think bring them in on that.
Sure.
Bring them in on, what the mistake is or what the violation is, and also what the response will be.
Right.
I think empowers them
think so.
to be allies.
Yep.
Really, we give them those tools to be the allies that we want them to be.
Right. What we don't want is for school districts to become reactive.
Yeah.
You know, because
Yeah.
what they do is they become reactive and then they look to put a Band-Aid on
Yes.
the situation.
Yes.
But it needs to be a part of the culture of the school district.
That's right.
A culture of respect, a
Yes.
culture of empathy, a culture of, strong,
That's right.
positive relationships with one another. And to create that culture starts with some deliberate actions.
Yes.
And so, at the beginning of the school year and October, if you're watching this in October, it's still not too late.
That's
You're
right.
still early in the school year
Right.
to establish, norms around what's acceptable language and
Yes.
what is not acceptable language.
right.
We often will, punish students for using profanity, or some teachers will just allow it. It's not a big deal at all. This is not profanity.
Right.
It is much more profane
Yes.
than
I
profanity.
agree. I agree.
And we say that because there is a history here where this word was taken and created specifically
Yeah.
to demean, dehumanize, to create separation,
Yes.
to create shame.
That's right.
And everything that is negative.
Yes.
Centered around this word. And it's not to say that any other racial slur, like no racial slur, is acceptable.
Right.
There's a history behind each of them, but we know that the history behind the
Yeah.
N-word is steep and deep.
Yes.
And so
that's right.
even though society, may be, turning ahead or excusing the word because artists use it in music and use it in song, it is still not acceptable.
That's
It
right.
is still not appropriate.
That's right.
And it still injures. Even when we say, I'm just using it as a term of art, or I'm just using it as a term of endearment, that's not acceptable, especially in the school setting.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah. So I think so this is obviously a conversation we could continue to have because it runs really deep in our American society, unfortunately in American pop culture. And this is a conversation we can continue to have. What we hope is that you actually have these conversations in your own professional circles.
Right.
We hope that in your space of as educators that you actually kind of wrestle with, like, what are we going to do about this? We hope that you find it as unacceptable as we do. And we hope that there is a determination, there's an intention to really address this amongst your students.
Right.
We don't think it's that hard, but we know that it
Yeah.
can be challenging. And so we'd love for you to reach out to us and let us know how those conversations went. We'd love to hear about some of the strategies that you've employed in your spaces to really address the use of this word, to really help students kind of understand, as you talked about, how steep and deep this word is. So let us know how it goes.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah.
Again, I'm Dr. Tonya Breland.
And I'm Erika Leek.
And thank you for joining us.